I've had this oil leak on my 2012 Chevy Cruze 1.4 liter for a long time, and I've thought it was the oil pan every time. So I replaced the oil pan thinking I didn't put RTV on this little seam here well enough. This little black piece that's below this metal is actually part of the timing cover seal. This black seam goes up and around to the inside and then follows around the whole metal gasket here. This metal gasket has separated somewhere on the inside and the back here and is letting oil to go through, and then it squeezes between the rubber and the metal right here and then drips down into the oil pan. That's why I always thought it was the oil pan. That's why I always replaced the seal, and then it was good for a little bit and then it would start leaking again. So I'm going to replace the timing cover as well as the oil pan seal. This is the new timing cover seal, and to give you an idea what I'm talking about, on the top side here, right here, here, left and right, as well as the bottom, this is the piece that's leaking. And so somewhere this rubber piece is leaking on the back side. I'm guessing right in here. It gets in between the metal and then drips down to here and moves its way out and then falls down onto the oil pan. And that's why I'm going to replace it. I think this whole thing is just old, hard, not working anymore. So let's get to it. Now you gotta take this bracket off. You're gonna want to make sure you support this side of the engine from underneath. There's nothing else holding it up on this side. So if you're gonna change the oil pan, you need to get the oil pan off first so that you can then brace it and then take this off. If you brace it with the oil pan on there and take this off, well, you're not gonna get it off at all. So you need to have something holding it up. Quite literally everything over here needs to come off because the timing cover is underneath this. So your water pump, your air conditioner, your alternator, your belt, everything, all that stuff needs to go, which means you also need to drain the coolant because you're going to be taking the water pump off. And the coolant passes through the timing cover, actually, believe it or not, because the pump sits on it, so it has to get from the engine to the pump somehow if the timing cover's in between. So I just took a hose, put it on the, there you go, you can see it on the nipple of the drain there. That way I can funnel it into a jug and not make a mess. So to hold the engine up when the oil pan is off, instead of using the oil pan, normally you just put a block under here and push a jack up against the oil pan to hold the engine up while you're trying to get those two brackets off on the side. I don't have the oil pan to do that because it's off, and I don't want to use it to do that because it's in the way. So I made this really redneck bracket here, just laid it on here, scribbled some lines about where it should be, and then kind of lined up where these would go on the outside edge of the block, and then I drilled a hole for the tube that sticks down. So this bracket then will sit up in here like this, and those blocks there contact that surface, and that one over there on the other side, and this tube goes down into the hole. And then I'll put the jack underneath this. It'll hold up this side of the engine. It's not touching the timing cover housing, which is this different colored metal on the outside where that seam is. And then we can start disassembling everything off the front, including that bracket up here that is holding the engine up in the air. Oh, what size was that? Shoot, I didn't even pay attention. I think it was a 15. Could have been a 16 though. Or an 18 or a 17. We'll just grab them all. Alright, 18. Whoa, no, that's way too big. Let's try 16. Not quite. Looks like a 15, right? Yep, I knew it. Oh man, whoever put those on last put them on tight. It was me. I put them on last. When I get these out, I'm not going to take them all the way out. Like this one I'm going to remove just a little bit, but then I'm going to put it back and engage a few threads until I get all of these. And so if something happens, something goes wrong, like I don't have that jack under there properly, or it slips, moves, whatever, the threads on here, hopefully it drops a little bit and then catches, and so it doesn't drop all the way and, you know, snap a housing on the transmission or something, you know, just make life worse. So that's the plan. My God, what did I do? Must have used some red Loctite or something. My gosh. And I don't like using impacts on these. I don't want to snap these and just, you know, make more work for yourself. This is an aluminum housing. The bolts aren't aluminum. They're, whatever this says here, 10.9, so they're pretty strong bolts, but you never know. Sometimes they're in there to the point where you throw an impact on it and it snaps. Yep, see? I don't know if you saw that on the camera. This started to move as this guy is getting loosened. You can see the engine is shifting a little bit. And that's because all the weight transfer is starting to go onto that jack on the block underneath. And we're going to double check that, make sure it's good before we go any further. Those are loose. This whole thing moves, so before we make any trouble for ourselves, just double check things. Quick note, you will have to take the bracket that was right here off to get the bracket off of the engine as well. The bracket on the engine, the bolts are too long, they hit the wall or the frame here, and you can't get it out, and then you can't get it up or down without removing this guy. So you remove the piece that's on the top, and then you can take this bracket and move it out and kind of shimmy it around to get it past that wall and pull it out the top. 12 millimeter on the tensioner right here, this bolt, and then you push it clockwise like you're tightening it, and then you can take the belt off. If you forget which way the belt goes, rewind the video and see which way it was. Before taking the belt off, loosen the water pump pulleys, bolts here. Otherwise, when you go take them off, the whole thing's just going to turn. With the belt on there, you kind of get some resistance that helps keep it stationary. A lot of these connectors over here are going to have to come off. This has to come off, or at least up and out of the way, so that you can get the valve cover off. The valve cover does bolt down onto the timing cover, so you'll have to take that off if you're going to replace it, because they always seem to blow a PCV valve or something in there. Now's a good time to replace it. I'm going to replace the water pump at the same time right now. There's a little bit of shaft play and my coolant level always goes down because there's a technical service bulletin about it. I've had the water pump forever, just never got around to replacing it. Now I'm doing pretty much everything in one go. So if you're doing the same thing, or if you're doing any one of these pieces, it's going to be largely the same process. I'm going to start by taking the water pump off. Just get that out of the way. I know it's going to make a mess when I take it off of the timing cover. So that way everything else doesn't necessarily get the coolant and stuff into anything, and it kind of stays on the outside of the cover. So make my mess first and then clean it up. I'm disconnecting this side first. I think it's a little bit higher. This side's a little bit lower. And so if I can maybe get this side out, I can suck some of the coolant out before I actually disconnect it from the timing cover. But a trick here, after you get these clips off from the hose that, you know, clamp onto the inlet or outlet, is take a pick and run it up into between the hose and the outlet or inlet, whatever. That way you can kind of separate the seal that sort of happens. There always seems to be some dry stickage that you gotta undo, and then that way you can kind of move the hose a little bit easier. You can see there, and then give it a twist or a pull, and then it should just slide off. So, little trick. Got the thermostat side of the pump off now. That's this over here. This is the seam. Crack it open, and thermostat's sitting inside there. It's kind of bad lighting because my light's dying. But that's where you're going to get most of your coolant coming out. It's through there, and then once you take the water pump off completely. But now the water pump shouldn't be connected to anything. The inlet and outlet is disconnected. Now we can just take it off the timing cover. This can, for the most part, sit off to the side. It goes to the radiator and your turbo coolant lines over there, and also the oil cooler, which is an oil cooler and coolant heat exchanger in one. It's kind of a temperature regulator, I guess you could say, for the oil temperature. I have all the bolts off of the water pump now. There's a pry tab right back here. You can stick a pry bar or something in there and kind of peel it away from the engine. And this is probably where you'll get a ton of stuff popping out. A lot of coolant, making a mess. So, got the water pump off. If you're just replacing the water pump, this would be where you just put your new one in and reassemble everything. But I'm going to clean this up a little bit. There's some residual coolant sitting in there. I'm just going to take that out as best I can. Then work on taking out all the other accessories. That includes taking off the crank pulley, your tensioner pulley. You got to remove the alternator. You're going to have to take the air compressor or the air conditioning compressor off. You don't have to remove it or disconnect it or anything, but it's going to have to come off and probably forward towards the front of the car so it's out of the way. And then we can start looking at the bolts that hold the timing cover on. See what else needs to come off on the top here. I know, like I said, the couple of these bolts are held down onto either the timing cover or these cam pieces here. So yeah, got a little bit more to take off. Something to pay attention to before you take this crank pulley off is there's this little tab here, just a little line. It's best to line that up with the hole down here. There's a single hole. There's these longer oblong oval holes, but there's a single tiny hole, and it's best to line that up with this mark, because then you're at top dead center and you're in the right position for when you put everything back. Once it's there, you don't have to do much. You just put it there and leave it, but you'll just have to put a socket on the crank here and rotate it. The alternator has two bolts holding it in, that one and then one down here. And you can just get a pry bar in here and kind of push it a little bit and wiggle it free. It sandwiches on a little arm or tab down here that the bolt goes through, so you just need to kind of push it off there, and then of course make sure that your battery is disconnected, that you disconnected it from the back, the main power line, and then you unplugged it. Otherwise it might be a little bit of a surprise when you start grounding stuff. Here's one of the tabs I'm talking about with the alternator. It sits on top of this, and the arms go on either side of it, front and back, and then the bolt goes through this, through the alternator, through this, and then to the back side. And there's another one up here, right there. That's the other tab, and it just gets held in there by those two bolts. But otherwise I have it sitting right here. It's just resting on the power steering rack right there, and I just disconnected it. So most things are off now. I'm purposely leaving the valve cover and the balance pulley or the crankshaft pulley down here till last. Last thing now, besides those, is to get the air compressor or the air conditioning compressor off. It is on a bracket right here. This bracket is onto the side of the timing cover, and you have to take 3 bolts off of the compressor to get at the bracket that is bolted to this. So it's kind of a two-stage right here. But there's this bolt here, there's one down here, and then there's one on the back side, and then the bracket has 3 bolts as well that are in almost the exact same locations, just moved a little bit. And then I just plan on moving this forward a little bit out of the way so that I can get at the bolts for this bracket. And really for this bracket, only 2 of them on the front here, these 2 are holding onto the timing cover, so I'm just going to try and take those off and then hopefully the timing cover can just slide past them and I can leave the one that's on the engine block itself in the back. There it is, disconnected. Here's where the bolt was. You can see it's sticking out here. You actually can't get it out all the way because this little housing component is in the way, but it doesn't need to. I actually left 2 of these bolts just sitting in there, and then all I have to do is just move this forward a little bit inside of the way. Then I can get at the bolts that are for this bracket here. One of them is actually, you can see the head sticking out just a little bit right there. The other one's up here, and then the other one's back here somewhere, and you can get at them. Get that off, and then we can get the pulley off, and then we can get the valve cover off, and then we should be able to take all the bolts off of the timing cover. One of the reasons I'm leaving the valve cover for last is I don't want a lot of dust. You can see how dusty that is on top. I don't want a lot of that stuff falling in there while I'm working on everything else. I want it to be as clean as possible for the camshaft and the lifters and whatever valve train is under there. I just want it to stay clean, and so keeping it covered as long as possible is the way to do that. To get that crank bolt off, I just put an impact on it. You can see there. You can take the inner liner of the wheel well out, or I just smashed my impact in there and moved the liner out of the way. It's plastic, and then hit it a couple times with the impact and it comes right off. But you still want to make sure that this pin right here, this hole, is lined up with this marker here. I've colored it red, put some red paint on it so I knew where it was and wouldn't lose track of it. But I'm going to put the bolt in a little bit further so that I can get my impact out, and then I'll just back it out by hand. Some notes about the pulley here. If you lined it up, like I said, with this hole on that tab or the alignment marker, it's really easy to put back. It can only go on one of 2 ways, so it's either 180 degrees out of phase or it's in phase, or in alignment, I guess, whatever you want to call it. And then on top of that, you know, it's got this hex shape on it, but you can see here that you got 2 flat spots, so you either have it this way or you have it 180 degrees the other way. But either way, if you have your alignment tab the right way, when you go to put it back, everything should be the same. Taking the valve cover off is actually pretty easy. It doesn't require doing anything that I've done up to this point. So if you're just replacing the valve cover, you can do that completely on its own and don't even need to worry about the timing cover. But essentially it's just all these perimeter bolts that you take off, and take this plastic cover off. It just snaps down. Take the 2 bolts holding the coil pack on, and then it comes up. And there's hoses and stuff in the way here that you need to move out of the way, but other than that, it's pretty easy to get off. So now that we have everything else out of the way, that's the last piece, and then we can start blocking the camshafts and the chain and everything so the timing stays the same when we put the chain back. This one bolt on the timing cover is longer than the rest. All the other ones on the perimeter, like here and over there, they're all the same length. This one here is the only one that's slightly longer, like probably a centimeter longer. Something I failed to mention on the first time around here, these horizontal slots and that half circle, which is really the center of the camshaft, you want that half circle at the bottom and this horizontal part at the top. That way the horizontal slot has enough room to reach across the top of the head here, instead of the other way around. When it was at the bottom, it would hit the wall here and you wouldn't be able to lock these camshafts together in the same timing. So you want to make sure that this is at the top half is at the bottom. Now if you've done what I did, where you already took the timing cover off and you don't have that tab, is you can put your crank pulley back on there and just rotate it. And this timing tab, the timing alignment pin or hole, is roughly in line with this chain actually. If you were to look down along the chain here, the hole, the pin, is right here. And you can see it kinda matches up with this. It's close. So if you don't have your timing cover on anymore, like I don't, that's its rough location. And then once you're in the ballpark, you just come over to your camshafts and you look at the horizontal slots, and if you can put a tool in there to lock them together, then you're good. That's pretty much all you need. Is you need to make sure it's at top dead center, but it doesn't need to be 100% the center. It just needs to be at the top, give or take a little bit of whatever stroke it's in. This is where my leak was coming from, is right here. You can see that the gasket didn't have as much contact on it as it came out to the edge. And when I was pushing at this from the bottom where the oil pan would have been, it was really tight back here, and then it got looser as you got towards the edge. And what happened is all the oil would slowly just seep past this right at the tip and then drip down the oil pan down this way. That would be the bottom of the engine. And that led me to believe that it was always right here. I just wasn't putting enough RTV to seal the timing cover against the oil pan, but really it was the oil or the timing cover gasket itself, not the oil pan. So that's why I've been replacing it. Something else you might be wondering is, why did the front of the timing cover leak and not the backside? Well, here is your oil pump. It gets run off the crank directly. It has this hexagonal, it's hard to see, I'm shadowing it. It has this hexagonal key inside here, and that key matches up, you can see the flat sides here. That key matches up with your crank pulley, and the crank pulley has those two flat sides that go onto the crank. So it all interconnects together to turn the pump in here, and it's a off-centered pump, which is really, really common, and it's actually common to have them in the timing cover too. And then this is the output of the oil pump. So what happens is, if this part at all is leaking, as well as this part down here, the oil is going to come out of this and start running down here. Well, if it starts running down here and through just surface tension wants to crawl around here, it's going to meet up with this seam and slowly seep its way out here if this seal isn't tight. So really, I think it's twofold. You have oil in here that's getting splashed down, getting run down from wherever. You have this seal here that was possibly leaking. I don't know for sure if it was or not. It doesn't look like it had as good a seal on this side as it did maybe on this side, but then it was also definitely, this part of the seal was no longer sealing, so everything that was in this vicinity, all the oil, was allowed to just seep its way out slowly. Here's the markings I'm doing before I take the chain off, and this will help me line up which teeth went back onto what link in the chain. So not only do I know that I don't have one tooth out or one chain out, one link out, I know exactly where it went, so the exact same tooth is going back onto the same link on all of them. And I did that on these two up here on the camshaft, and I did it down there on the bottom side of the crankshaft. So that way, when I put this back, I have an exact mark of where it was. One thing that people might be concerned about is that this paint is not lubricating? One of those words. It's not like oil. I'm not too worried about that because, one, this paint is on the top, and two, the tooth is barely covered, and three, as soon as this starts heating up and going around, that paint's gonna just wear off and dissolve into the oil, and it's not gonna matter. And if you really care enough, you can run it for like 500 miles and then change the oil a second time, but I'm not gonna worry about it. Something else I want to point out, this is the original crankshaft seal. I bent it here up in the top trying to get it out because I was hammering it from the backside of the screwdriver, but I want to point out something. This inside, the brown part, is usually like a Viton type of material, and you can see there's little grooves on it, the little rings or slots. And that's so when the shaft is spinning on this, if any oil is seeping out, as it hits those grooves, it'll want to move back to the inside of the engine. So the grooves were kind of down into this side. So what happens is, as the crankshaft spins around this way, it'll hit the groove and try and follow it back down into the inside of the engine. This is the outside, the inside would be under here. That's what the original one looks like. The replacement has a revised version. It's very similar. It has, instead of those little grooves, it has, well, come on, focus. It has just rings on it that are not as good in my opinion. If I can get it to focus on there. Well, anyways, the inside of this is different. They changed it. And they changed it enough that I'm actually not going to use it. There we go. You can see it now. It focused. You see how the grooves do not have slots going inward? They're just circles around the inside lip. Compared to this one, you can see the grooves that would help channel oil back to the inside. Another point. See that spring on the inside on the original? There is nothing like that on this one, on the new one, the revised version. It is just a single lip. That's all it is. There's no spring, retaining spring. There's no extra fat seal on there. Just, in my opinion, a much cheaper design. So, thankfully, that's a very common size. You can go buy your own. It's a, what is it here? The new one's got the size on it. There it is. It's a 42-55-7. And what that means is it's 42 inside diameter in millimeters, 55 millimeter outside diameter, and 7 millimeter thickness. That's common. It's not a special size or anything. So you can go buy your own, which is what I did. You can see I got a 42-55-7. This one does have a spring on the back side. It's actually a much beefier spring than the factory one. And it's got that thicker lip. The only thing this one does not have are those grooves to channel the oil to the inside. I'm not going to worry about that. I've used these kind of seals on like hydraulic pumps and stuff, given they're much smaller and turned at a much slower RPM. I don't think this is a problem. If it is, then I will find an old stock of the original one and replace it with that because I think it's a better design than the new one. Dealer claimed that the new one has been installed hundreds of times on all kinds of cars and they never had a leak. I don't want to trust it because I don't want to have to do this again. So this is what I'm going to replace it with, and I just bought this off some generic O-ring sealing site. Pick your favorite online and order it from there. But 42-55-7 is the size. I'm going to install the new seal. Something about this seal too, it's much heavier. It's a completely Viton seal. It's heavier. It just, in my opinion, is better. But clean out the seat there and then kind of set it in there such a way that it wants to sit straight or it'll go in straight. And then I made this, I 3D printed this tool, and you can find this pretty much anywhere. It took all of 2 minutes of internet searches to find it, but all it does is it sits down into the opening there, has this flat surface to help you drive it in, and then stops when you got all the way in. It'll stop against this outside metal surface. So it's just to help you. You don't need it. You certainly don't have to buy a 3D printer to do this. I've used a block of wood and just put a block of wood on here and hit it with a rubber mallet. That works plenty of times. I did that on a transmission input shaft seal. Worked great. So these aren't too bad to do by hand. Just takes a little bit of patience. And then here's what it looks like installed. You can see it sits flush all the way around. And that's all that tool is for, is just help you push it down all the way and seat it correctly. You're going to need to compress the timing chain guide tensioner. It's oil driven and it's this little plunger here. And what you do is you push it in and you can see it moves and it's pushing oil out. And there's a little ridge there on this end right next to my finger there. And what you do is you push it in until it lines up with this little hole. And then what you can do is take a nail or your tool if you have the tool, and it slides in there, when this is all the way back, and it will hold it in place so that this can be loose and free, and you can disconnect the one bolt down there, or whatever you want to call this, down here, and it will take this off, so then the chain comes loose. It doesn't have any tension on it anymore. And just like that. So you can see it's in that slot, it's holding it down, and now this is loose along with our chain and this guide, and we just got to take that one bolt off at the bottom and we can take that guide off. Now both timing chain guides are off. We can go ahead and pull the chain off. This side on the left was a T40 down at the bottom holding it on. On the right side it's a T30 because GM likes to make sure that you own every friggin' tool in the world before doing these jobs. Here's a lesson on why you really mark these things well. I marked, you can see this whole side, so then I know that this is the front, or I guess the side towards me. And you can see that that tooth on the gear is marked really well, but the ones on the other sides are not. I did that on purpose. I wanted just this one tooth and this one link marked. And I did that on this side as well. And I got a little happy here. This tooth on the side is marked, but the one in the middle is really marked. I did it on the crankshaft as well. And I did it from the underside before I started taking anything apart. And to my surprise, that just this loose, everything being loose, you take it off and look at it. Look at, I already skipped a tooth. The tooth that I marked with the red paint does not line up with the link anymore. So if I was to just try and line this up and put it where I think it goes without these markings, I could have been wrong and been out a whole link. Now I might find that out when I go to start it up, or I go to put the guides back on. Maybe the guides wouldn't fit anymore, you know, or something like that. But either way, I know exactly where it goes now, thanks to the markings that I did beforehand. Alright, timing chain is off. And that should be our last hurdle, and we can take this gasket off and put our new one on, and then installation is reverse of disassembly. There's a little tab on the front side right here. You can just pull, and it gives you something to start with. So when putting this back, the gasket needs to have a little bit of RTV up in this corner, and same on that corner over there. It's where the head meets the cylinder block, and you just need a little bit of RTV to close this gap, because the cylinder head gasket has a little bit of thickness to it, so there's just an ever so slight gap here that if you didn't put RTV here, oil would just slowly seep right through that crack and just drip out. On the gasket, the timing cover gasket here, almost everything I put back that has O-rings on it, or like a rubber seal like this does, I put silicone grease on it that's meant for like high temperature water lines. I'm going to do that on this as well, except in these spots. I'm going to leave a bit of a gap, so I'll put like, you know, silicone up to here or something on either side, just up to just below that pin. And then that way the RTV and the silicone don't mix and create some weirdness that would eventually leak. And so this is where the RTV is going to go. You can see there's a little bit of ribs or indentations where the RTV would fill in. There's one on both sides, one over here as well. And since we're putting RTV on it, you got to put it on the cylinder block and the head, that seam, put the gasket on, then put the cover on, all within a short amount of time. Not crazy fast, but don't take all day to do it. I also like to clean off all of these surfaces, all the mating surfaces where the gasket's going to go, with acetone. Just ordinary acetone, put it on a rag and wipe it down. It doesn't leave residue, and it takes all the grease and oil and everything off really well. I first go over it with a razor to try and get all the little remnants from the old seal off, so every now and then it sticks to it, but once that's off, wipe it down with acetone and it's good to go. And I do that on both the block and cylinder head side as well as the cover side. Getting the timing cover ready to go back in. I reprimed this with oil. It had a bunch of oil in it before, but I just poured oil down here, and then you just start turning this one way or the other. You'll find out if you turn it one way, it'll come shooting out of here down where it actually is supposed to pick it up. Turn it the other way, and it's going to try and push it back out of here, and you'll just see it kind of gurgle a little bit. So that way it just has some fresh oil in there, nice clean oil when everything's back together. Some of it's going to fall out of here anyway, but you want to have some in the gears. So now I have the chain back where it's supposed to be. I have the timing cover gasket, the new one, on there. The tooth lines up with the length that I marked on both of these. And then it's important to get this crankshaft one as well. And you can see that tooth lines up as well. But there's a lot of slack in here because I don't have the tensioner actually putting tension on the chain yet. And I can honestly say that if I did not have that marking on the bottom on the crankshaft there, I would not have gotten this right. It would have taken me a lot of trial and error of trying to get this chain tugged correctly because I took this side off last, so I put it on first, and this has to be pulled tight. You have to make sure that this is in the top dead center. Remember lining up that balancer, that little hole with where the marking on the timing cover was, but we don't have any of that. And then this side, you have to make sure it's loose enough, but it's not skipping teeth down here, so that when you put this on and you tension it, see how it pulls it tight? And there's some slack and then pulls it tight. And that's what that tensioner up here is going to do. It's going to push this out. Now that the timing cover is back on and everything was aligned, I took off the block that was holding these two camshafts in alignment. I put the pulley back on here on the crankshaft just to set it there so I can rotate the engine a little easier. I'm going to rotate it to make sure that nothing binds and make sure that all of the valves and everything don't hit pistons. They shouldn't because, we marked everything. But that's kind of a final check that if you rotate it by hand slowly and nothing binds, it shouldn't, in theory, do that when you're running the engine. Something else I'm going to do before anything else, I'm going to actually take this pulley off and put the oil pan back on. The reason is because the oil pan has a lip that sits behind this pulley on the bottom side, kind of where my finger is, but 180 degrees on the bottom. And it makes it a little difficult because you have to put this side up first and then the other side by the transmission, which means you're tilting it and you kind of smear some RTV. It just makes it a little more difficult. If you take that off, nothing's in your way and you can just raise the oil pan straight up and mate the RTV to the engine block on the oil pan and everything nicely, cleanly, and then once that's done, I can put everything back. You can have this engine, this whole thing, sit like this without a jack underneath it. It probably shouldn't stay like that for long, but you can do it so you can install the oil pan and not have anything in your way.